Hi, my name is Britt Gilman, and I'm the Research Project Analyst at the Deep River Public Library. Since 2022, the Deep River Library and partners have been co-leading this local history project titled Not Born from a Virgin Forest, Deep River and Area's Earliest History. The title of this project is derived from early recorded accounts of Virginia Adams Hunt, who proposed that the area that we now call Deep River had housed families for decades prior to the arrival of the town, and therefore Deep River was not born from a virgin forest. This project was started in response to requests to expand understanding of life in our area prior to 1945. I'd like to thank our partners, the Schoolhouse Museum, the Laurentian Hills Library, Professor Stephanie Adams, Alex Stevens of Deep Tech, the Deep River District Community Foundation, and to the New Horizons for Seniors grant, who generously funded this project and made our work possible. The following oral history that you're about to watch is a subjective first-person account, an individual recording of life in the early days of Deep River and area. We hope that by asking questions and capturing responses, we're able to add these oral histories to our collection of historical accounts to expand understanding. Enjoy.
Hi, I want to introduce myself. I'm Diane Lanier. I'm the president at the Schoolhouse Museum and Royal Buchanan Wiley McKay Historical Society. Today with me I have Dr. Richard Cruess. Dick is a family friend for many years, and although he has not lived in the area, he has spent almost all of his summers since the 1930s in the area. He originally grew up in New York and has lived in Montreal most of his life. He's had an amazing over 70-year career as an orthopedic surgeon, researcher, and professor at the University of McGill. He and his late wife, Sylvia Cruess, were both highly recognized leaders in the medical world around the world. Dick has agreed to share with us some of his early history and favorite memories of the area, and so I'd like to welcome Dick.
Well, obviously at 93 years of age, I'm delighted to be here. I totally agree. They asked Winston Churchill how it felt to be 80, and he said just fine considering the alternatives. So considering the alternatives, I feel fine.
Great. Can you tell us about some of your early history here? And I guess we can kind of work our way into the forward from the early 1930s when you came with your family to this area, and what brought you here?
Well, my mother was born in Pembroke. Her grandfather was a jobber in Pembroke and had a very large family, and clearly there were times when he was prosperous and times when he wasn't. That, I think, was the lumber industry in those days. And her mother came back here to the family farm, which was very close to where the Irving station is in Pembroke. The farm got torn down when they put that new road in. But her family was very strong. She was the daughter of a United Church minister. My father grew up in a Quaker family on a farm in Lindsay and won a scholarship to Queen's, and roomed with my mother's brother, and I think that's clearly how I got here. But they spent all of their summers, my mother did, in this region. They actually used to go to Cobden for their summer vacations. When my parents moved to New York, my father became an actuary in New York City, and my mother was what everybody now calls a homemaker. I don't think the term existed then. Nope. Anyhow, the family remained really important, and my mother and her brother, who was my father's best friend, he was a surgeon in London. They started spending their summers first at Petawawa. I was born in 1929, and there's pictures of me at 6 months of age at Petawawa Point. with my grandfather. And I have quite literally spent a part of every summer of my life in this region since. And by the way, they really worked to spend summers here, because in those days it was a 2-day drive from New York to Petawawa, and staying in a tourist home at night on the way. Petawawa was wonderful, but of course the war broke out, and starting around 1939, it got to be pretty busy and not a very restful place for a vacation. So my uncle moved up and built a cottage in Deep River, which is just below Pine Point Lodge. It's been converted to a house. At least one family, there was a family named Byers who lived there, and they're no longer there. But so in 1940 was the first time I actually spent time in the Deep River area, the previous years having been in Petawawa. But I have vivid memories of that 10-year period in Petawawa, with Giesebrecht's store and banana ice cream and Selkirk's butcher's store off the road. And the road, of course, between there and here was a dirt road. And we would have an occasional safari. I don't know what we were going to Chalk River for, but I can remember driving to Chalk River. And that was a half-day trip in those days. But
So would that have been along the Mattawa?
Well, the old highway.
Or the old highway.
Yeah.
The original
which wasn't paved yet.
Okay.
And I remember the McGregor's Hill, just this side of Pembroke, and the old cars. It was sometimes we did wonder whether we were going to make it or not. But, anyhow, so 1940 is the first time I came up here, and we spent time at my uncle's cottage. Then the war broke out, and we couldn't drive any longer, so we would take the train from New York to Westmount, where we would get off in Quebec, cross the track and get on the local train to Ottawa, go to Ottawa, and we routinely would have lunch in a very wonderful oak paneled restaurant in the basement at the Shadow.
Oh.
And then walk back across to the station and take the local train to Chalk River. And my uncle, being a surgeon, he had extra gas, so he had a car up here, so he'd meet us. So from 1940 until 1946, we were, that was of course before the plant, if you recall. We would spend our time here. We spent the first summer with my uncle and aunt. But after that, we were at Byways for 2 years, and I remember that with. By the way, we'd bought a little boat and a 1 3/4 horse engine that Byways stored for us in his barn. But Byways had cabins down on the river.
Yeah, right beside that.
Yeah, and but we ate on the road.
At the restaurant.
I don't think there were any kitchens. I think they were just sleeping places. And as a matter of fact, I developed my passion for raisin pie at that time. Nobody in New York ever heard of raisin pie, but raisin pie is obviously because of the lumber industry and stuff. And that's my birthday cake is always a raisin pie. But it was Mrs. Pie, I can't remember her name, she was a good cook. Anyhow.
So Vern Cornier would have been owned it at that time,
I think it was before Vern Cornier.
Okay.
I can't remember the name of the man. We then moved from Byways to the North Star, and we spent the last 4 years at the North Star with a guy named Victor Ross, was a very nice man, and I just had a magic time. I was a city kid. They had an old Model T flatbed truck, and they took the garbage up twice a week. And the Model T you had to crank; it didn't have a starter, and so we used to draw straws to who could start the Model T, and all the kids would drive with the garbage in the back. It was just an idyllic time. And again, you got to remember, I was a city kid, and I was coming up to a different way of life and different people and. Boy, I just had, and with relatives that I liked, so
Right.
I was part of a kind of community. Where we now are, which is right opposite the Sand Point at Fraser's, the whole section, the 50 acres, was owned by a man named Willard Beatty, who was a native Ottawa Valley person, as it was his wife. His wife was named Kemp, and they were from Kempville.
Okay.
And he was the manager of the mill in Pembroke,
Okay.
which I think it went through several names. It was the Laurentian Lumber Company and ended up as a consolidated mill.
Okay.
And they spent their summers with a manager of the Royal Bank from Pembroke, and they became very close friends. So my parents bought an acre of land and built a cottage. We couldn't build until the end of the war, so 1946. So in 1947 was our first, my first time in our cottage, which I repeat is right opposite Fraser's Landing. And I have literally been coming ever since.
And so it was there originally, your parents' cottage, and
Yeah,
now yours.
now it's mine. That's right.
Yeah.
And we then the Beatties and the Smiths. Smiths had one child, but he lived in Toronto and wasn't interested. So we bought the 49 acres that we didn't own and the other cottage in 1986 when basically they got too old to run it. And so we now have two cottages and a beach. And it has turned into our family compound. I have two sons and some grandchildren and a great-grandson. And I have spent a portion of every summer of my life here. Our two sons have spent a portion of every summer of their lives here. And our grandchildren have spent a portion. So this is where our family gets together and stays together, and it's wonderful. But I think in the early days, I'm an only child.
Oh, okay.
And there was nobody at the other, the Smiths and Beatty's cottage either. So I got to be very comfortable with adults in the first place. But there was nobody to play with, and I was going, when I was a teenager and going away. And so I got to be really close friends with the people who were living here. Garnet Allen was my closest friend.
Oh.
And I have to tell you that, again, I'm coming back, I was a city kid. And people in the city, if you need something done, you hire an electrician or this or that.
Yeah.
Here, you look after yourself.
Yeah.
I just, Garnet became a role model. A part of who I am today is a result of my contact, of not being stuck only as a city kid.
Right.
I came to just have great admiration for the way of life that they had. They were so self-sufficient, helped each other. It was a very, even if they don't like each other, they help each other. It's a community.
Yeah.
So it had a huge impact on me. Ernie Milkey was another friend. Mel Stewart, who was closer to my age, became one of my closest friends. I fished with Mel and drank beer with Mel, and I just so particularly in teenage when your character is really being formed, I identified as much with my friends here as I did with the people I was growing up with and going to university with. I've always said this, by the way, that who I am is in large part because of my contacts with here. And it was, in a funny way, it's the same as it was, and it's different. Life was much simpler in those days.
Yeah.
We only got electricity in our summer cottage in either 54 or 55. So before that, it was we had a gas pump to fill a gravity tank in the ceiling. So at least we had indoor plumbing, which was nice, and a kerosene refrigerator, a Serval refrigerator, and the pleasures were simple. There weren't any supermarkets. Jeff Howard ran general store in Chalk River, and he used to come up on Tuesdays. This was when we were at the North Star.
Okay.
But it loosened up when the plant came, obviously. But he'd come up on Tuesdays, take your order, and deliver on Thursdays. And there wasn't a lot of fancy stuff. So we did a lot of fishing, and we ate a lot of fish. And I was the only young person around, so I cleaned a lot of fish. And there was an ice house at the Beatties. And again, I was the only, they were getting older, so I, putting chunks of ice in refrigerators is not a lot of fun. But I was the only one who could do it, so I did that. So it was so different to living in a sophisticated suburb of New York.
Right.
Anyhow, as I say, I loved it. I repeat, we fished a lot for fun, but also for food.
Right.
And my uncle had a 10-horsepower engine and a Peterborough cedar strip boat. That was fast. We had a 1 3/4 horsepower engine, and I've never forgotten. And by the way, from the time we were in Petawawa, there are islands off the Petawawa Point, and the Rogers family from Pembroke had an island, and they had a son who was about 10 or 12, and he was running his own outboard, and that was, as far as I could see at the time, the highest thing I could ever aspire to, was to run my own outboard motor. And we had a 1 3/4 horsepower Johnson, and one time at the North Star, my parents let me take the motor out all by myself. And by the way, no life jackets in those days and stuff like that. But I was really nervous, so I didn't open it up all the way. You know, I must have been doing about 2 miles an hour, and was terrified. But
just learning to steer is sometimes a bit of a challenge.
Yeah. And by the way, when you start that early with boats, it doesn't matter what size they are. You learn how boats respond and stuff. So anyhow, dirt road wasn't paved until the 50s. Then came the plant, and that changed a lot. And yet it hasn't either. You know, this is still, for you guys, not so much the people who live in Deep River, but for the
rural people,
the old local people that are here. It's certainly the core set of values and beliefs that was there then is still here.
Yeah.
You know, you guys haven't changed, but it's interesting. Nobody knew what was happening at the time. It was very secret. You know, if you're out on a boat, there were guys with guns looking at when you were fishing around the plant. And, yeah, I mean, you couldn't take pictures and stuff like that. So my uncle, of course, had just put some money into a fancy new cottage, and he wondered what was happening because they were starting to deliver the town site and stuff like that. My father was an actuary. He was actually the chief actuary of a New York insurance company. And he said, "Oh, don't worry about that. I'll find out what's going on, because everybody has to buy insurance, and we need to know what people do if we're going to sell them insurance." So he started making inquiries in New York about what was happening here. And it didn't take more than about 2 weeks before the FBI was in his office wanting to know why he wanted to know what was happening in Chalk River. Because, of course, they were building an atom bomb, and it was very secret. So from having an indigenous community where the thing is, in about 3 years we had a 2-story Eaton's that was selling everything, and an A&P, and all of a sudden the world was different. But I remember, I've mentioned Garnet Allen. He really was. We were really close, and he he probably had a cash income of $50 or $100 a year before the plant came.
Right.
Most people.
Yep.
And he became a plumber and fairly prosperous. And he said several times that he would happily go back to the time when life was simpler and they only had $50 a year to spend, but their life was richer.
Really?
It's sort of, and I could certainly understand that. When I say I was a city kid, that was hugely impressive to me.
Yes, because certainly the times through the Depression and others in this area,
it was tough.
Very tough.
Yeah.
And for them to have these fond memories of that time,
Yeah.
When they were growing up through that kind of turmoil really in the world,
Yeah.
and still finding that was some of their best times.
Yes.
It's quite
But
amazing.
the things that don't change, of course, we keep on. We get people coming up to visit us, and we take them out on the river, and they say, "Holy smoke! Why doesn't anybody know about this?" And of course, we don't want anybody to know about it. But the river hasn't changed. The river remains just absolutely magic, spectacular looking, and stuff like that. And you can surely screw it up, but it's being pretty well maintained, and people care, and
Yes.
it's not being abused
Or overly developed.
Or overly developed. I mean, there hasn't been more than 2 boats on the river in the last 2 or 3 days. It's for some reason.
Yeah. No, it's quite quiet. You mentioned, I think, in some of our earlier conversations about the cottage and some of the interactions that you had with some of the local people at your uncle's place, and the Walkers was one name that you mentioned. Were there other families that were there, primarily, I guess, before the town was kind of cleared of the native settlements?
The answer, well, two contexts with the indigenous community. The first, in the 1930s, my father and my uncle commissioned an Aboriginal who I think lived at the Swisha, but he did later, but to make a birch bark canoe.
Yeah.
And I'm almost sure that I'm correct, that we picked it up in 1935, and I think we picked it up close to the Narrows where the lighthouse is, at a beach, and I think it cost $35 now. And we used that birch bark canoe until about 10 years ago when we gave it to the museum.
Right.
But it lived in the basement of our cottage, and every year you have ribs that you knock out for the winter, and then you knock them back in, and you submerge the canoe so that it absorbs water, and it weighed about 25 or 30 pounds. It was very skittish, but we spent most of our lives in the canoe, so it was all right, and we used that canoe. The other thing, which was a little less, my uncle was a busy surgeon. He was prosperous, and my aunt had a lady who helped her clean from the community named Mrs. Lemure, who was the wife of Mose Lemure, who owned part of the place where the plant is now.
Yeah.
And they got to be quite good friends.
Oh.
It was sort of interesting linking up. And the Lemures moved back on the Wiley Road, I think. And then I think they sold. I don't know.
There's still some on the Wiley Road.
Are there? Okay, all right.
Yeah, some of the descendants are still in that area.
Okay, but they were buddies. It was sort of interesting that Mrs. Lemure used to write my aunt at Christmas with a Christmas card, "Dear old pal." So that there was that, but that community almost got to be not identifiable after they moved.
Right.
I don't know we almost weren't conscious. We had known they were there before, but when they sort of got dispersed, I think they lost their collective identity a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. Certainly, we've heard that they weren't entitled to own property if they had native status, so most had to given up
Yeah.
that native status to actually retain property in the area. So that kind of changes, I guess, whether you felt that was something you wanted to be proud of, or if you wanted to more hide.
And by the way, my impression was that some of them left the area. That there got to be fewer.
Yeah.
And of course, frankly, we didn't know. We, the general public, even if we were sympathetic or friends, had no idea about the details of how our society treated them.
Right.
Which was, of course, not very well.
Yeah.
But and again, this was certainly of interest to us. But the Allens were Garnet and the girl's father had been the principal bush superintendent for Fraser Brothers,
Right.
And was Garnet used to say that he was self-educated, but he was clearly an intelligent man, and the Allen family were clearly really bright, competent people. Mm-hmm. And I was, I was a teenager by myself, and they sort of adopted me. And Mrs. Allen Sr. had a gastric ulcer that was operated on by a surgeon that I came to work with in Montreal named Gavin Miller. And she only had a half a stomach, and that meant that she had to eat frequently. And that was just fine with me, because no matter when I went in, I could get something to eat, and often pie. And Garnet also, I sort of learned to drink beer with Garnet. I didn't drink as successfully as he did, but when I say they are responsible for who I am, it was that family, and they used to poke fun at me. I went in with a pair of dirty pants, and I remember that he had a bunch of sisters.
Yes,
Clara,
all
May,
sisters.
All sisters and stuff. And somebody said, "Your pants are dirty. Take them off. We'll wash them." And so I did, and they washed them and sewed all the pockets shut. That was the type of humor.
Mm-hmm.
Another
Little
thing
pranks.
I've never forgotten that they enjoyed much more than I did. We were sitting at Fraser's Landing one time on the porch, and I had a pair of boots with free laces, so they tied the laces to the leg of the chair, and of course I got up and went flat on my face, and they thought that was wonderful. But simple pleasures,
yes,
stuff that no television, no stuff. And by the way, they were not being disrespectful of me at all. They were making me part of the group. They do the same thing to each other.
To each other,
yeah.
Yes.
So I, as I repeat, as an outsider, city kids, it meant a lot.
Yeah.
And I started medical school in the summer of 1951, and as did my wife. She was from Cleveland, Ohio, and we were engaged formally at the end in first year and married in second year. So the summer of 1952, she spent some time up here, and as many people know, she died last fall.
Yeah.
But from 1952, I was never up here without her, nor was she ever here without me. She became a doctor and successful, and we both were working full time, so we had vacations were coordinated and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And part of the reason why it means so much to the family and to me is that it meant so much to her.
Yes.
I mean, she was as the happiest times we had were up here.
I think you spent quite a bit of time, at Fraser's Landing and above it at the Teapot
that's right.
Fish Camp. Yeah.
Well, Jack and Loretta Fraser were friends of both the Beatties and the Smiths, who had the cottage next to it, and of my parents.
Okay.
So we started off, having social backs and forths, and Jack Fraser had a lease on a Teapot Lake, which is 3.5 miles back, and has a cabin on it. I can't figure out exactly how old it is. Got to be 110 years.
Yeah, because it was the original caboose.
That's right.
And had the big square.
Yeah, and it was where
chimney.
They ran the bush operations because
Yeah.
they were cutting back there. So Fraser's Landing, when we first went there, Jack Fraser was I think the only male survivor of the Fraser Brothers Lumber Company, and it was full of the landing itself, which burned, of course, was full of sort of antiques, and they weren't kind of antiques like you might see, not Quebec antiques.
No.
They for example, they had a carving of a bobsled in the winter, hauling a big couple of sleds full of logs with a carved figure of a
man.
A man with the horses. That was just spectacular, and they had fur rugs, bear skins and stuff like that.
Buffalo, I think, that was used on the cutters and
yeah, that's right. I mean,
warm.
it just one. It was almost like a museum.
Yeah.
And stuff. And when I've sort of forgotten some of the details, but when they got older and actually were moving out of Ottawa, they either sold it or transferred it to a club which had Garnet, Ernie Milkey, a man named Jack Barry, who was married to one of the Stewart girls, and John Gillies of the Gillies Lumber people in Arnprior.
Okay.
And they spun off Teapot as a separate club. And so Garnet and Ernie, essentially, that became their sort of vacation home.
Right.
And they spent a lot of time there. And they made Teapot into a separate club that I was allowed to join.
Right.
And eventually Dick Hamilton and you guys.
Yeah.
That for about 30 or 40 years, that was sort of a part of our lives. Still is.
Yes.
Yeah. But again, the landing, it was really tragic when it burned. But,
yes. Yeah. And some of the pictures, I know you've shared some of the pictures from 1913 and the number of outbuildings at that site. And
I think there were 13 buildings or something like that?
13 or more.
Yeah, that's right.
Some of the
because they were keeping horses to run the lumber operations.
Yes.
It's
and the steamboats would stop there and drop the supplies off, and people and whatever else was needed would be brought up. And because the Fraser family, a lot of them were actually in Westmeath.
Yes, they had a farm in Westmeath.
The way to get up here would be through the steamboats, would be the fastest way.
Yes, that's right. I forgot it,
Yeah, because that would have been going on at the same period of time that the logging was happening.
Yeah, my mother can remember when she would spend summers in Pembroke. She could remember the Weeza, the original old steamboat that used to come up to the Swisha. And she can remember Saturday night dinner dances where they'd leave Pembroke at 5 or 6 and get back at 12 or midnight and stuff like that. And but they would go to Weeza Rock and then turn around and stuff.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. People talk now. It's almost too bad that there wasn't something like that happening now, because
Absolutely.
it sounded like it was like a phenomenal kind of evening out and music and dance and
again,
food.
No visiting band, totally local.
Yeah.
It was people arranging their own fun.
Yeah.
Are
there any other places along the way that Swisha or other areas that you frequented more often than others?
Well, look at we would we would go fishing at least every other day as a family, and if we had visitors and stuff. So we spent literally hours on the river. We would have, with the Smiths and the Beatties, who also shared people, friends from not local area.
Right.
We would have picnics. We would go fishing with 2 or 3 boats.
Okay.
You know, the first 2 weeks of July, when the bass season opened, again, there aren't very many people who remember, they ran logs down the Swaya, quite a lot of logs down the Swaya, and the entrance to the Swaya into the Ottawa had 2 big cribs built that went back, maybe a quarter mile to keep the logs from, because it was narrow.
Like a log chute?
Yeah. It wasn't a chute.
Oh, okay.
It was just to keep the logs from going on the shore.
Oh, okay.
And then there were a couple of piers at the mouth, and they had a boom, and there was about 4 or 5 years. Then eventually I think they stopped logging back there, but for 4 or 5 years, the most exciting fishing I have ever had in my life. We would go fish on a boom timber, sometimes fall in, and we got some inexpensive fly rods, and we'd drop a hook with a worm on it upstream, and it'd float under the boom, and bass like to stay in the shade. And by the way, the bass, we would never not get a bass of 4 or 5 pounds. I mean, they were really big.
Yeah.
And of course, then you'd be trying to catch a bass on a fly rod who was about 50 yards down under in the middle of logs and jumping up between the logs and the boom. It was the most wonderful fishing I think I've ever had. And we were getting a lot of fish too.
I think the pictures I've seen of different people's catches at that time.
We're like that. We got a whole bunch of 4 to 5 pound bass, which are big fish.
Yeah.
I mean, big for bass.
Yeah.
So that's sort of something I never forgot. The other thing that we did, which is certainly local, is we, at least once a week, maybe twice, we'd put a canoe on a car and we'd drive back the Des Moines Road, and we'd fish for trout in the lakes, in Chenard's Lake, and stuff like that. And by the way, we'd do that as there'd be 4 or 5 of us. It'd be a social occasion as well, and take lunch. And I was the only able-bodied male, so I carried a lot of canoes.
And they weren't all the lightweight birch bark ones?
No. As a matter of fact, I made a mistake. I worked one summer. I wanted a canoe. My father said that I had to pay for half of it. So back in New Jersey or New York, where I earned money, and I chose badly. I got a Peterborough 16-foot prospector's canoe, which weighed about 60 or 70 pounds. Then, of course, I had to carry that bugger for the rest of my life until we replaced it. But again, that was sort of that was our entertainment.
Right.
And the Des Moines Road was just a wonderful place. Medore's Inn was, which became
the Bonanza, I believe.
Bonanza, yeah, but it was Medore's.
Yeah.
Henry Medore, no, Joe Medore ran the inn with his sister, Mrs. Vondette. And so we'd go fishing, and we would contract with Mrs. Vondette to cook us a meal on our way out.
Oh, okay.
And it was, absolutely spectacular. Always with home-baked bread, home-baked pies, and stuff like that. That was a stopping place.
Yes.
If you remember.
Yeah.
They had a big room with a big stove and a whole bunch of racks up in the ceiling over the stove where people hang their clothes and socks to dry them out in the winter.
Oh.
And then they had a dining room, and they had a bar.
Yeah, I thought that there was a bar there.
Oh yes,
Yeah,
well,
a pretty lively bar.
That was Quebec,
Yep.
and we're in Ontario, and
Was there some prohibition or
well, I don't remember
limitation?
prohibition.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I do know that the rules about drinking and availability was a lot different, and this was Puritan Ontario, and that was evil, sinful Quebec, and a lot of people went over to just like when we were in Petawawa, they used to go fishing, and there's a place just upriver from Petawawa called the Short Turn, where the river takes a sharp turn.
Okay.
And we used to go fishing there. My father and uncle were fishing in the birch bark at the Short Turn, and Fort William had a hotel even then.
Yes.
And of course, again, drinking was different. You couldn't buy anything on Sundays. And my father and uncle actually came upon a drowned soldier who'd gone over for Saturday night at Fort William and stuff. That was Quebec offering things that were not necessarily available here.
Yeah. A few different things that we take for granted sometimes now and don't realize that so much has changed over the years.
Yeah.
So just wonder.
But again, I come back to while this is a modern community and stuff, but there still is the core that's always been here.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the pies are still pretty good.
The pies are still pretty good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and the museum,
Yeah.
the museum
No.
tends to keep some of the past.
Yes. Yeah. We've been very fortunate that we have people who have some of that local knowledge of some of the skills and continue to bring some of that. When they did for I think 25 years the lumberjack suppers that Ellen and Floyd arranged, certainly brought that history back and.
Well, and I guess the other thing that hasn't changed, and I'm not smart enough to know whether it's always the same, but it's the resourcefulness and the independence of the people and the fact they look after themselves. And that may be truer of rural communities everywhere, but it certainly, that hasn't changed very much here.
I would say you're correct. The ingenuity, some of the ways.
Garnet Allen was one of the most intelligent people I had ever known. And I don't think he got out of 6th grade.
Probably not, because it would have meant you would have had to
stop working
and actually travel by train, because often there weren't any classes beyond, even in later years to up to grade 8 was the maximum in the area.
To little school up the road here.
Yeah.
Like the schoolhouse.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I mean, it is interesting how many important things have not changed.
Yeah. And it's wonderful that you're able to keep your cottage and have your family share some of that enjoyment.
This is a personal thing. It's quite clear that our 2 sons, I'm 93, I won't be around for a long time, but they have, that's as important to them as it was to us. And our grandchildren, one is a Crown prosecutor in Toronto, and he's spending more time up here than I did at his age.
Oh, wow.
And has a grandson now, or has a son now. And another grandson lives in Calgary, and he flies and spends at least a few days here every year. So it looks as if it will stay as the thing that keeps our family together.
Right.
And by the way, if it doesn't, certainly my wife and I won't be here to worry about it, but we've told them, look, if it doesn't work, sell it.
Yeah.
It does, but as long as it works, and it looks as if it's going to last for a while.
Well, it's nice to see that the family has enjoyed their time up here as well, and enjoyed you've been able to pass on those traditions in a sense
Yes.
of having the fun and enjoying this beautiful area.
Yeah, very much.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time and sharing with us some of your long history here, and I guess rekindling some of the memories that even I have of Garnet and many of the other people that you've spoken about. So thank you so much.
Okay.